In a more somber video today, we will look at the case of English force, right-wing politics, and its hex that anybody and anyone who has any talent or knack for it is verboten from becoming significant in the political realm through various mechanisms, I would say, that are baked into both the English system and perhaps the English people in general. Now, today's case, Cursed Tale of Jonathan Bowden, is probably just the best exemplary of that in a more modern state. Previously and historically, we could look at cases such as Enoch Powell, Oswald Mosley, men who tried to assume power through their methods, the best notions that they had available to them, but were unsuccessful for dissimilar but also very similar reasons. And this recrudescence that you'll see is, I would say, product of the English as a people. And so they produce people you would think would lead, but are admonished and denigrated by the populace because of its own hubris, its own ignorance, its own, I would say, tragedy, in that it's going to always think it knows best rather than perhaps having the foresight or forbearance around decision making. So do I think that this is good? No, I will do my own way. My own way ends up being terrible, thus the comeuppance and the, say, regret. And there's a lot of retrospection, I think, that goes on, and particularly around the casuistry and rationalization reasoning of English politics, where we say, oh, if only we had done this differently. When at the time, it was very clear that this was probably the end result. You were picking what is a chamber filled with a bullet and playing Russian roulette and then blowing your brains out. So it's very hard to feel much empathy with the English for that, because they have always made their own bed, for better and for worse, and now much more recently only for the worse. There comes a time, I think, in the maturity of a state as a nation that it recognizes itself as the ultimate power or a subservient power. And the English, unfortunately, and very rightly, have come to learn themselves as a very secondary and tertiary effect. Now, the unfortunate reality of this is that your politicians want still to be recognized globally as important, but in any case, you just see the very clear effect of being a second tier nobody, in that your prime minister is always relegated to nothing positions and being very unimportant unless there's something that's needed specifically in an instance. Keir Starmer is embodying this quite purely by his insistence on being important legally, globally, in the ECHR and other legal institutions around this. And in general, he's thought of as a bit of a joke, a farce, because his inability to be political in a political space retains to him a notion of weakness, insipid powerlessness, and all of his decision-making ends up reeking of committee decisions done in front of a focus group, such that I would say almost every single decision is wrong, and that there's a huge unpopularity of both him personally and as his party collectively. So that should give you some realm of idea of where the English are as a people, as a populace. Nigel Farage will not save them. As nice as it is to have reform, talk about issues that we actually care about, it's still not the golden bullet. Well, it probably is a golden bullet. It's a nicer version of the way to kill yourself. And so we would think of maybe the continuation of the curse that I'll outlay here. Now, Jonathan Bowden as a symptom, or as an undercurrent of the strength of the Englishman, but in his inability to rule England, should exemplify, once again, the trend, the theme, the motif that I'm talking to you about. If those of you who don't know, and I only recently came across Jonathan Bowden, maybe the last 2 years or so, he's probably the most, say, esoteric, but he's definitely a cult-like figure to some people on the right sphere, and has been for, say, 15 years now, 20 years almost, where to the degree that many, say, forums or the darker places of the internet as they used to be, obviously there are none that exist now, but were probably championing him to that degree, that he was speaking on issues in a way that felt very prescient to the time that we're in now, for instance. And he speaks on, say, Nietzsche a lot, and he speaks about other, say, historical intellectuals who preached a certain power philosophy. And in particular, I think that for him meant doing just as much as reading and writing. So I think there's a nobility behind him as he stood for the things that he was trying to, as a testament to himself, as to say, I think of myself as a powerful right-wing man such that I will run for politics in the right-wing sphere. He was probably the least successful of the triumvirate that I had recognized as probably the examples of the curse here, in that Enoch Powell was very close to being Prime Minister. Oswald Mosley was not close, but also in such a significant position of power that he was a national threat and enemy of the state. And so it's very easy to see how the effect, you would say, of a right-wing man has been slightly diminished over time. And also in saying that, Enoch Powell, I don't think necessarily was, say, that right-wing. He was probably much more masculine in that very real sense than right-wing, maybe. And his policy primarily on immigration and its associated effects, byproducts, is the primary reason he gets held up as this lionized figure, lauded and applauded. But it isn't necessary that he was, say, right-wing on every issue and held those beliefs, whereas I think someone like Jonathan Bowden probably was, and much more effusively attests to being a disciple of Nietzsche and a pagan, for instance, around that philosophy that you are imbued with the power your ancestors have deigned to give you. And I think that that's a very personal belief system that works really effectively if you want to be a man of power. It isn't such that you can rely on God's intervention or Jesus' magnificence or the Pope's blessings or any of these very ephemeral and arguably inconsequential notions, such that you are here, your ancestors have given you the strengths of their genetics, of their genes, of all of these things, and would have wished for you to be the man or woman that you could be. And so one is very real and the other one is very intellectualized. And in that way, I think Jonathan probably held the right belief. It was said here, and this is from one of his preludes to one of his books written by somebody, I can't remember which one, just saying that when Jonathan did speak in public, he wore a wooden runic pendant to express his pagan beliefs. The symbol on the pendant was the odal, or edel rune. This is representative of home or homeland. A home is a space that is won by one's ancestors that must be vigorously defended by the descendants, or it will be destroyed. Once again, very apropos and pertinent here because of his belief system as it regarding, I would say, very specifically England for Jonathan Bowden. Now, whether that was a naive, I think, arbitrary belief system, because you have to consider that the West now in its totality is much more unified behind the Anglo-Viking American empire, and such that everything else that resembles the Gothic West is actually subsumed by it, suborned to its power in that way. So there isn't really a differentiation. I know it feels very defeatist to say that England is inconsequential in that way, but it just is the case. So we have to recognize realities, which once again, someone who's very patriotic for somewhere like England, thousands of years your ancestors being there, it once being the glory of the globe, it's very hard to rectify this position with the reality. I don't like that it's like this, such that I will try to paint it in a different way. So I think Jonathan was maybe a little bit guilty of this. He held these beliefs very passionately, so it's very hard to disabuse him of these notions. But I think it is just in general maybe his naivete around this that caused him to be maybe not as effectual and lacking in efficacy on his political positions to assume political power. If you knew the position you were in, you would try to act in a way that would garner you the most amount of power, the effect of what you wanted out of it. And so for him, if I was to give him advice, say when he was a younger man in his 20s and 30s, if he's going to hold these beliefs, it's probably not inefficient, but maybe misplaced of him to have been involved with English politics because of the way that it was institutionalized and much more of a backwater. He would have been better off moving to America and being an advisor a la Steve Bannon, for instance, again with Trump. So something like this where he was purposefully committed to a regime that was much more important to the globe, to Western, particularly for himself, the Gothic man, Teutonic man's fight against the rest. So this is a continuation of that. I think his life in particular, though, had him bookended between these two very dour and bleak positions. So he lived in a piteously and maudlin England, because post-World War II, it was a horrific landscape populated by a populace with no energy, no vim, and such that it built into a multicultural hellscape across his lifetime. So he lost all the parts of England that were good, and it grew into something even more horrible in that way. There was a mutation to it. And he had to witness all of this. And that, for sure, imbues you with a certain passion and maybe disregard for the sensible to the irrationality of the mind to say, I want to fight against this no matter what, or in any shape, form, or fashion. Whether that was effective or not was maybe secondary to him, and such that, once again, it was very easy to see why he was not effective as a politician, because no one's ready to hear the things he was saying at the point in time. The way he delivered them and the mode was maybe not representative of what I would say is an efficacious way to deliver political messaging and missives. You need to be able to understand the realm you're playing in just as much as you don't want to debase yourself in front of it. No one wants to go and be a Tony Blair because he's a disgusting neoliberal freak, but he understood the system and how to win power. So it's hard to argue with an outcome regardless of the spawning point of it. Jonathan, though, once again, had a very great understanding of Western Gothic man's potentiality, and particularly his soul experience. He was probably, like me, very fond of Spengler, and I think he's mentioned him a few times in some of his speeches. And I'll just read you a small quote here, at least from him, from Jonathan, to say that competition between groups is part of the stuff of life, and contemporary society is based on the formulation of that is not the case. And because it is the case, nature will trump all the liberal arguments. The problem is that if it doesn't take a political form, nature's trumping of liberalism will be a very painful process to live through, such that you are reaping the benefits of that, and in particular, multiracialism, multiculturalism, as it's manifested, is always going to be the painful pill to swallow for the liberal, because the effects of people hating you means that you are attacked, and such that it starts to be uncomfortable, and the places you live are unrecognizable, and white flight kicks in, and there's all these mechanisms in self-defense that the liberal will go through before admitting that it believed in something fallacious, believed in something naive, or believed in something fanciful. So Jonathan understood this, I think, deeply in a way that resounds with us today very easily, because I would say, once again, it's the problem here probably that being prescient and knowing something the way that it will happen, it's bound to happen, doesn't necessarily mean you can stop it from happening. So it's the inevitable juggernaut running at you that you're incapable of stopping with your hands, and you won't escape it. So such that inevitability you find yourself in, what would you do? And this is always the perennial terminal question for Western strong men. You have one chance to do something. You need to figure out what it is that you're best at, or equipped to be, and that bespoke methodology of yours needs to be applied. You need to do the thing that you're capable of doing, to what degree you are possessed of power. And this is, once again, maybe speaks a little bit to Jonathan. Maybe he was, as he lived truly into that, that was his best efforts. Now, Jonathan had he had some mental illnesses, and there was some other afflictions and maladies that he was going through. So it's easy for us to understand that someone like that probably went through a lot of personal turmoil, and it's difficult for him to maybe straddle the rational, reasonable part with the emotive, passionate part of living in this society. Once again, putting ourselves in a position where you've seen everything sacred to you crumble into dust, such that you're learning more and more about this collective guilt that England had for bizarre reasons, and was forcing down the throat of all of its citizens. You're not allowed to be patriotic. You're not allowed to believe in the Gothic soul supremacy of the globe, even though Americans were displaying it and showing it to you ebulliently. So it's very difficult to see how that was something a man with no cognitive dissonance was able to reconcile himself with. And then the other end of this coin is the attacks. So lefty and liberals will always call you far right, fascist right wing, I think he's himself an avowed fascist, and for reasonable reasons. So he made it very clear that fascism as a concept was completely acceptable because all you're really doing is recognizing a hierarchical sense of society, saying power exists in a structure in this way, represented by strong men doing strong men things, such that we want to take care of those around us as best we can, using this prism and understanding that there is a, I'd say for him in particular, Wodenistic aspect to it. We want to do the best for the Gothic tribe and the way that the Gothic tribe does things. That is fascistic. It's this understanding of the knightly honor system, chivalry and gallantry. But Vikingism won World War II. The American Viking dominated the globe, and particularly England, overshadowed completely and consequentially dwarfing anything that the Englishman could pretend to be doing in the late 20th century. So he lived in a very penumbral space here before that. And it's very difficult to exorcise yourself from these demons. And clearly that's the case. The leftists, though, don't understand this and felt as if it was fairly easy pickings for them to laugh at him, to abhor him, to make fun and traduce him because he believed in things that seemed either antiquated or they were extreme, which, once again, is nothing maybe necessarily untrue about those accusations. It's just it's very easy for a plebeian audience to laugh at something that they don't understand, and they try to mock. And this mockery, all it does is fuel resentment. And I think it's very clear as to why Jonathan was not capable of appealing to the common man, because you start to resent the common man for his foibles and his inability to perhaps understand his own position in the quagmire. You are sinking into the sand. Let me pull you out. And all they'll do is use their free hands to point and mock you. This is the type of environment and atmosphere he lived in, and we continue to live in, I should say. But there has been, for us, I think, a glimmer of hope in that Caesarism does come for us and has been coming. So we get to witness it. We get to see the rise of technology as the infinite will to technics, as Spengler has pointed out, become the centrifugal force for us, or this inertia around our society's progress is baked into the idea that technics is above and beyond all. So we have this eternal recurrence here for that. And I think the end of Western civilization, the Faustian man, the Gothic man, as he's terminated, liquidated, will be in a firestorm. It is just natural that there is going to be this ending to it. But once again, at least we can live into the grand period of that part of our history. Now, the two kind of segments here which point to that from the leftist perspective was one written by some English rag, where the journalist goes on to denounce far-right politics because their nearness, their proximity to being almost into far-right gave them some insights to rejecting far-right. This is very common in previously, but your penitent rightists or always leftists, but appealing to the common denominator as a outrage bait or some clickbait. So the journalist went on to say, with the allure of far-right politics growing, it's important that we address the root causes of white radicalization. White radicals generally tend to be loners in their bedroom with little connection to the outside world. We need to deal with the underlying psychological pain that is leading susceptible individuals into the arms of extremists such as Richard Spencer, who make false promises of restoring power and glory back to the white race. I don't know who Dickie Spencer is. Oh, I think he's that American turncoat, probably. Anyway, like Bowden, Spencer comes from an arts background and is an avowed thespian. I think there's also to be admitted here that the class of political class are mocked as being drama students, basically, nowadays. And this is very true. If you are theatrical, then you're going to be able to make yourself appeal to people. I think the latest instance of this has been in American politics, where almost every congressman, mayor, senator has some sort of theatrical motif around how they operate. So let me see, like AOC crying at a fence because Mexicans are deported, or the current mayor of New York just being a flamboyant homosexual and doing those sort of things, or the several other governors and mayors doing very theatre kid, they call them, I think, activities, where it's very embarrassing if you're a serious man or something, even woman, about politics. The Margaret Thatcher being a theatre kid is very laughable because she would, rightly so, denigrate someone who would be so embarrassing and pathetic. But nowadays we have TikTok appeal, or need TikTok appeal for the masses. So someone who is appealing on TikTok, Nick Fuentes, gets the most audience. And this is what the sort of fact-seeking, the findings, PR teams, marketing teams have been. Sorry, that was a very large tangent. Like Bowden, Spencer comes from an arts background and is an avowed thespian. And like Bowden, he's a charlatan selling dreams of a new Roman Empire to vulnerable young men who, more than anything, need hope and dreams in a world filled with politics of fear and division. I don't think Bowden was selling that, by the way. I think he's very clearly understood that the idea of Rome, for instance, was based on very different principles, and such that we have the Anglo Empire, and the Anglo Empire still has its hopes and dreams. It's just based in America. Unfortunately, maybe that blinded Jonathan a little bit to the reality of the situation, but the continuation of the Anglo man as it marches on is kept aflame in the American political sphere and will rise through that in the next age of Caesars. Any attempts at counter-nationalization lack the empowering appeal of the alt-right's message. This must be old article if they're using alt-right. If we are to combat it, there must be a far more sincere effort to understand. Failure to do that may cost us many more minds and ultimately lives to acts of extremism. So you can tell the tone of the author here that their intent is really clearly to be, you shouldn't have divergent interests. You shouldn't want these things for you and your people because these are necessarily evil things. And the moral clouding and the injection of my own rectitude onto these things makes it clear that my position is the valid moral one. And once again, it's very easy to see why people don't get Bowden, because he was a Nietzschean, and knowing that, you just understand that values are, well, transmogrifiable, but they're also valueless. I can say that your values are meaningless to me. They have no coherent messaging. There's nothing congruent from you to me in the way that you have a perspective or a substantiated idea around anything that I care to consider. So this as a sort of adumbration into or even an introduction into what you want to be telling me, explaining about your own moral position is just pathetic. It's meaningless drivel. The last one here by the Jacobin magazine, where they posted that Jonathan Bowden is a fascist for our post-literate age. He died 13 years ago today and is a cult figure on the international right. He self-published books and films, philosophized about white replacements in pubs, and fantasized about being a millionaire father while living alone in a trailer. And so you can see, I think, not that these aren't real descriptions, and I'm sure that if you framed these things, you're a spin doctor, and you were able to, which I think rightly enough, say that these things are true, it's that, so what? So what if his life wasn't as fulfilling as he had intended it to be? Many of our lives aren't as good or grand, or we're more vainglorious, or we're inhibited by many things that we wish weren't there. There are different courses for different horses, and it isn't to say that we're all satisfied with how the outcomes are. So I think this traducement here very clearly was to embarrass, or try to effect an embarrassment on anyone who follows someone who's such a loser. Can you believe this guy was such a freak? Which is ironic, obviously, because the leftist and liberal positions are always one of acceptance and welcoming, unless you disagree with them, and that disapprobation basically prevents you from being part of the club, which you're then occluded into viewing the real reality of their minds, the hyper-reality. So I think for us, it's just to understand Jonathan was still a man. He had a man with many very good and sincere beliefs. And so his life didn't necessarily reflect the outcomes he would have wished for himself, but he was also born into that role. That's who he was. He couldn't affect that change to that level. You saw him with myopia. You see him as he was, as probably quite fragile, mentally, a slightly unstable person. But so what? Many grand men have been schizos. This hasn't stopped them from being important or from saying very deep and profound things. But it is a case, and I think it's very emblematic of the curse of the Englishman, that no matter what, England has this sour miasma affecting it, drowning it, and a pall is cast upon it, where no one can rise out of it untainted, and in that way becomes unelectable or improbable or, once again, verboten. You can't have them do anything because of the way you rise out of a country with such a stench, with such a curse and hex, prevents, I'd say, any proper politics from being conducted. Proper in this way being either historically institutionalized English politics, which was very well, or a strongman politics, which would also solve many of these problems. So you have at the bottom an aggrandizement of liberalism, which I think for Jonathan was a spook or a haunt. So he held liberalism as the disgusting enemy as it was to his position, to the right-wing position. But once again, I think for us to understand liberalism is just the soul of the Viking, just who he is. He wants the freedom to do what he wants and doesn't care what anyone else does as long as it doesn't impact his freedom. There's no infringement, impingement. So understanding that, I think Jonathan maybe was more malicious to a system that didn't like him, that called itself liberal rather than the true liberal position of a Viking captain or shipmate. And in that, he maybe had spookified himself to this. There's a metaphysics of freedom here that's very much polluted by modern discourse. And if you took the distilled version of the Viking liberalism and you melded it together with the knightly valor and honor system, then you would understand that the duality here is irreconcilable. But then downstream of those things is the perversion of them. And so even if in the after effects of World War II that the knightly Teutonic man had won, you would still see some perversion of it downstream. Maybe not as bad, and we wouldn't hate it in the same ways, but there would be some effect to it that we'd be sitting here discussing on the internet about. So I think for him, very clearly Teutonic knightly man, he had a disdain for this instinctively. And it's not that I also don't agree with him, it's just that we have to understand the metaphysical position before we start to attack it and try to, say, supplant it with something better. It's one of those things where we will see the pendulum swing back and there will be some recourse for us as the knightly man of virtue. But until then, you can just keep watching his speeches and his oration or reading his books and quotes. And I think that should give you a fair understanding of the great men that England can produce that end up being cursed and very fallible.